Now, as I mentioned, I made the decision to use trial tech support. And the reason for that was because I knew that I needed to focus on my advocacy. Changing my way of presenting trial was enough of a task for me without having the distraction of trying to do the technology on top of that. So the question is, do you need to hire trial tech support if you're doing a Zoom trial? Well, in the words of Dirty Harry, you have to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? I wasn't going to leave it to luck. So what I did was hired Trial Exhibits, which is a national company, and Noah Wick, who is their national director of litigation, personally handled my trial technology. I avoided all technology glitches. I did not have a single problem on my end because Noah was doing everything. Plaintiffs' counsel did not use outside trial support, trial tech support, and they were not so lucky. They had issues with their PowerPoint during closing, which I'll discuss in a minute. I was able to focus solely on my advocacy, and that really gave me an edge. I also had assistance with putting together a PowerPoint that had professional graphics and animation. And that's critical because when the jury's focus is solely on what's on that screen in front of them, the PowerPoint becomes very, very important. Finally, competency with technology is just as important with competency in any other aspect of your trial presentation. And competency is critical to establishing the trust of the jury. I wanted to appear competent. And so I had somebody who knew what they were doing do the trial technology for me. Yes, it was costly, but in my case, it made a lot of sense. Now, let me give you a look behind the scenes at what I had set up. This was the first day of trial. And as you can see, I've got one of the lamps in the picture. On the screen to my left, I have the Zoom call up with all the participants. We don't have all the jurors in there quite yet. And on the right, there's the speaker view of the person that's talking at the time. So this is me trying to take a sneaky picture. You can actually see my phone in there, so I wasn't as sneaky as I thought. But we've got the judge on the left of me, the bailiff on the right, and my opposing counsel in the bottom row. Now, this is the view from where Noah was sitting. Noah had a separate laptop set up, and he was helping to control the presentation on my end. You can see the webcam mounted at the top of that monitor on the right. Now, this photo illustrates one of the more important points we learned during this Zoom trial process, and that's that the way that you present your graphics makes a big difference. I did my closing over screen share, but this is a photo from it's actually a screenshot from my expert's testimony. I had him use a huge trial board illustration. So as older lawyers can rejoice, there is still a place for that in Zoom trials. It was very easy and user-friendly for him, and it came across crystal clear on Zoom. Screenshot's a little bit blurry in places, but it was crystal clear on Zoom. Now, when a plaintiff's experts decided to display a medical illustration, that was on a video screen right behind him. And somewhere between the video camera and the video screen just didn't translate well, and you could barely see the illustration that he was projecting. So this is definitely the way to go in terms of presenting an exhibit of this sort. Now, this is the very first slide, the start of my closing argument. I've got my first slide up. That's me in the same location I am today. And I'm going to click through the first few slides of my closing PowerPoint so that you can see what Trial Exhibits put together for me and why it made such a big impact to do things in this way. 1,838 miles. That's how far plaintiff number 1 had to travel to find an expert who would support her brain injury claim. 513 days. That's how long it took before plaintiff number 2 made her very first complaint of left shoulder pain. 2 out of 10 pain. That's the level of pain that plaintiff number 3 complained of at the emergency room. The numbers don't add up. That's my theme. Now, this is my favorite slide, and I won't bore you with my whole argument, but I want you to see what's possible, because before I had Trial Exhibits put this together for me, I did not realize that this was even an option, but it was something that they were able to put together actually in a very short time frame. They have a lot of these graphics on hand, and they have professionals who can create these for you, essentially anything you want. Now, here's another slide that I particularly liked, fit in great with my theme. Their life care planner actually didn't add the numbers up correctly. So we did a special slide reminding the jury of that, and did the chalkboard effect. This is something I never could have done on my own. Now, not only did the Zoom trial present certain challenges for me, but it presented challenges for jurors as well. Now, as you can imagine, looking at a screen all day, for those that aren't used to it, can cause eye strain and headaches. There are also sensory processing issues, and I'm not just talking about disorders. What I'm talking about is requiring the jury's brain to work in a completely different way that they may not be used to, depending on their familiarity with this technology. When you have a Zoom call up, as most of you probably have, if you have everyone on the screen, you can see movement by each of the participants. And when there are a lot of people on the screen, that's a lot of visual information for you to process. There's also distracting backgrounds. The jurors weren't concerned with how their backgrounds looked. And I'm sure we've all been on that Zoom call where we're looking at someone's background thinking, what is that? Or trying to read something or figure out what something is. It's very distracting. There are also multiple views you can take in Zoom. So depending on how you have it set up, you see different things. And it's a completely different way of learning and processing information that is a different variety of what we present in the courtroom. Now, for us, we're used to being on stage when we're in trial, but jurors are not used to the sensation of being watched all day long. When they're sitting in a jury box, they're not thinking about everyone looking at them all the time. But when they can see themselves in a little box on a Zoom call, they become hyper aware of their appearance and demeanor, and that's exhausting. It all leads to Zoom fatigue, which is probably something we've all heard about before. Being on a Zoom call all day long, regardless of what it is, whether it's a jury trial or a corporate meeting or whatever the topic might be, it's exhausting. At the end of the day, you're wiped out. So the best part, the mishaps and lessons learned during the Zoom trial. This required exponentially more preparation time. And let me give you an example of that. When I was preparing this closing argument and we were putting together this PowerPoint, which by the way went through 17 rounds of edits, my typical process of preparing for closing argument is I write out my outline, I run through it in my head, I might practice it in the shower or on the way to court in the car, but I don't rehearse it in front of an audience. Well, Noah at Trial Exhibits asked me to rehearse it with him over Zoom. And so we set up a Zoom call, and I tell you, I did not want to do it that way. But I'm glad I did, because the first run through was, I thought, a disaster. I got much, much better the more I practiced it. Because if you haven't used a detailed PowerPoint during your closing, now I'm not talking about a 10-slide PowerPoint that hits the highlights, but if you haven't used this kind of animated, detailed PowerPoint, it takes a lot of practice to sync up your argument with each slide and to make sure that everything's in the right format and that you hit the highlights in the right places so that you're not skipping around. It took me about 5 hours of rehearsing to get ready for my closing argument. Oh, and on the first day of trial, about an hour before we were supposed to start, my power strip died, because of course it did. Fortunately, Noah had an extra one. Otherwise, we would have been running cords through the office trying to get everything hooked up. So lesson is, have backups and backups of your backups. During closing argument, plaintiff had issues with their PowerPoint. And I don't know if it was because they didn't practice it over and over, if they weren't familiar with PowerPoint in general, or if they needed trial tech support and didn't have it. But regardless, there ended up being a blank white screen share during a large portion of the plaintiff's closing argument. Plaintiff's attorney didn't acknowledge this. And the problem was that one of the jurors gets out his phone and emails the bailiff during closing argument, hey, I can't see what's on the PowerPoint. That's not what you want your jury doing during your closing argument. You don't want your jury sending emails to the bailiff. You don't want your jury confused as to whether they're seeing what is supposed to be seen or not. So my advice would be, and the juror's advice was after the fact, if you have a technology glitch like that, acknowledge it briefly and then move on. If he had said something to the effect of, PowerPoint's not working right now, we'll try to get it up and running later, on to my next point, that would have alleviated any concerns that the jurors had that their technology wasn't working on their end. Now, Zoom fatigue is something you need to be attuned to. So plaintiff's strategy of doing a 3.5-hour closing argument probably wasn't one that I would recommend, even in a case involving 3 plaintiffs and millions of dollars. I kept mine at 45 minutes, and let me tell you, that was as long as I wanted to go. But that was part of why I rehearsed, because initially it was much longer, and I had to hone and hone and hone until I got it down to just the salient, impactful facts that were going to make my case the most persuasive. And now the best part. I was Zoom bombed during the middle of my closing argument. And by Zoom bombed, I mean that the hackers of Columbia crashed our call. And they serenaded us with guitar and sang, and someone made obscene hand gestures, and someone else threatened that the judge was going to be hauled off by the FBI. Noah saved the day. He immediately jumped in and asked the judge to end the Zoom call and send out a new link to everyone. So that's what the court did. Ended the call. We picked up on a new link, and I was able to finish my closing argument without any further drama. After we got the verdict, I took the verdict in person. The court allowed counsel to either take the verdict over Zoom or in person. I wanted to go into the courthouse because I wanted to be able to interact with the jury and see the jury. So I went in for the verdict, and the feedback that we got was absolutely positive about the Zoom experience. The jurors all said that they liked the convenience and flexibility of using Zoom. Now, they actually had the option. The court gave them the option. If they didn't want to use Zoom for the trial, they could come down to the courthouse and sit in the courtroom and view the video and audio, listen to the audio, and complete the trial that way. None of them chose that option. None of them even debated that option. Everyone wanted to do it over Zoom. For purposes of deliberations, though, when they had to meet in person, the jurors said that they wished that the judge had asked each of them the COVID questions individually, because what their concern was that someone would show up and kind of maybe be on the edge because they may have been exposed, or maybe they had a symptom but they didn't really think it was COVID. But once they were in the room with the other jurors, maybe they wouldn't speak up. And so what the jurors suggested was that the court inquire of each of the jurors separately and privately so that a juror wouldn't have any apprehension in speaking up if they felt like they needed to qualify an answer to one of the questions. I was a little bit worried with the PowerPoint that it might look like it was too slick or like we had lots of money to throw around. The jury didn't get that impression, and I think that that is something that's going to carry over going forward. As people become more accustomed to using this type of platform and this type of technology, they're really going to expect the lawyers involved in the case to use technology to their advantage. And you may be thinking, okay, well, even if the jury didn't think it was too expensive, something like that's probably cost prohibitive for my case. Well, my PowerPoint, I can tell you, was 42 slides long, and it went through 17 rounds of edits, and it cost $600. So while that, I'm not saying $600 isn't a lot of money. Seattle's an expensive market. Maybe it's a little bit less where you are. Maybe depending on what you need, maybe it'll be a little bit more expensive. But if you do nothing else, even if you feel comfortable handling the technology yourself, or you have an IT person in-house who can handle it, you may consider contracting out the design of your PowerPoint. The jurors were very critical of plaintiff's PowerPoint malfunction, and it was mostly because it was confusing for them. I don't think they held it against opposing counsel that they stumbled with technology. It was just that the information wasn't conveyed to them as far as what was going on. They didn't know whether they were supposed to be seeing something, and all that was coming up was a blank screen. So the question I get asked all the time is, which way is better, in Zoom or in court? Well, I'm going to give you the lawyer's answer and say it depends. But for me personally, I prefer to present in court. That's what I'm used to doing. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. It's where I'm comfortable. But for my client's sake, if we're looking at avoiding a mistrial, if we're looking at controlling expenses, maybe a Zoom trial makes sense for them. And if it does, I want to be the kind of practitioner who can competently offer a Zoom trial as an option if it's something that the court's willing to consider. Now, in our case, the judge said multiple times that this was a unique situation that he didn't expect to be repeated. And I'm not arguing with that. I know that the court was concerned about setting a precedent. But what I will say is that the practical considerations that led to us completing the trial over Zoom are not going away. We had a lot of interruptions, as I've described, with people who were either exposed or were ill, or someone in their household was ill, and they had to wait a day or two or more to ensure that there was no risk of COVID. When you have those types of interruptions, trial obviously takes longer, and you have to reschedule experts multiple times, which, as we know, is a nightmare to begin with. But when you have to do it again and again and again, it can get very costly and sometimes not even be possible. We also had safety concerns. The area of protests in our city was, a lot of it was concentrated around the courthouse. And so there were logistical issues in getting jurors to and from court in a way that was safe. Going forward, it is going to be harder to get jurors if we require that they attend in person. And we're going to need more alternates, because as people need to quarantine or as they get ill, more and more jurors are going to have to be dismissed. So with those practical concerns, is it a possibility that we conduct more and more of our trials over Zoom? I think it is. And I plan to be ready for that contingency. Well, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.